Welcome to the classes in biology, primarily for NEET. And today, the modern era of biology with relation to preparation for the national examination has a lot of basics which need to be very clear. One of the most important basics is you require a lot of conceptual information on it. And at the same time, you should also be very analytical and very logical about learning on with relation to themes in biology. So today's class is just a sort of I'm just trying to help you out with relation to how do you read a small concept of what is meant by viruses. Now, the reason why I've chosen viruses because it's a contemporary theme in biology with the COVID situation. So let's get going on these particular things. Let's see how it works out. Fine. So when we look at viruses, we understand that when you take viruses, viruses have a complex organization of it's a complex organization of non-living chemicals. Basically, a virus is primarily a sort of an chemical compound. It's basically its chemical compound does not have living characters as such. And next thing is you call them as ultra-microbial agents because you can only observe a sort of a virus under an electron microscope. Microbes, which is they're smaller than the microbes, they're smaller than the smallest of the microbes like bacteria. They belong to a group of infective particles which are smaller than the bacteria, hence you call them as ultra-microscopic agents. And most of the viruses which you take primarily made up of RNA. They are made up of RNA. And RNA is supposed to be the most primitive molecule which has ever existed on the biosphere. So we have all primitive life forms have got their genetic material run on or made up primarily on ribose nucleic acid. So viruses are predominantly made up of RNA, though there are some viruses which are DNA. We are looking in terms of why do you call viruses as living or non-living? That's the central theme of the concept of what we are going to discuss for a while. And because they do not have a cellular organization, you call them as acellular. Otherwise, you can also call them as non-cellular. They do not have, because you understand that cell is a basic unit of life, which you have read it in schools maybe. Cell is a basic unit of life, it's got a structure, it's got a function, and it has got metabolism on its own, it's got a membrane, and it's got a DNA. Whereas all of these are primarily, or most of these are lacking in a component or in a molecule which is what is called a viruses. And but however, viruses are just like living organisms because they are infective. You will call them as infective agents because primarily if you take typhoid, if you take malaria, and you take a lot of viral infections, most of them are caused by infective agents. So let's look at some other properties like when you take viruses, viruses are basically filterable. So the virus living versus non-living concept with assertion reasoning is the goal of the class. So viruses are filterable, that is they pass through bacterial filters. That is they are smaller than the bacteria, hence they are filterable. They are obligate. You call them as obligate intracellular parasites. So it is essential, the meaning of the term obligate indicates that virus has got a definite relationship with the host plant. So it's an obligatory on the part of the virus to tag on a host plant in order that it causes infection, and they primarily reside within the cell, hence they are called as intracellular. And it's primarily a virus lives on a host plant for nutrition as well as even for causing the disease, so you call it as a parasite. So it's absolutely, it requires a living host for multiplication. Viruses cannot multiply on their own. The viruses cannot multiply on their own, so they require the living host primarily for multiplication. So if you take a virus and you don't give it a sort of host plant, they are unable to multiply because they are dependent on the host for the sake of multiplication. And what happens is the next one is they use the metabolism of the host plant. They basically require the sort of DNA, RNA, and the proteins and the enzymes which are present in the host plant, primarily that is required for the sort of a metabolism. Now, when you take viruses, they are chemically inert outside the cell. It means you can take a virus, take it like table salt and put it in a small sort of vial, put it in your pocket and even walk. So, they are basically chemically inert, that is, they are not dynamic, and their nucleic acids could either be DNA or RNA. Their nucleic acids are either DNA or RNA, not both. Could be one of these. Now, you got to ponder and wonder, how could a sort of an RNA come into a virus, and why do you say it is non-infective? As we learn by, we can just be knowing about all these things. However, they have got a sort of a protein code. So, a typical virus resembles a sort of a lollipop stick. You got in the center, you got the DNA or the RNA, and it's covered by means of a plastic cover, which is what is called a sort of a protein coat. And the protein coat is, now, why do you call viruses as non-living? They are inert, they are acellular, they are crystalline. You can crystallize a virus, and the crystallization of the virus is very important because they have crystalline inert chemical properties. They do not have a metabolism on their own. They are dependent on the host metabolism. They show no growth. A virus cannot grow all by itself. It cannot grow, it can only multiply given a sort of given a host cell. And they show no reproduction, they have no enzymes on their own, whereas they hijack the sort of enzymes of the host plant. So, these are all the basic properties primarily related to non-living properties is they are inert, acellular, crystalline, non-metabolism, no growth, no reproduction, and lack of enzymes. Now, what are the living attributes of a virus? Now, viruses, you would say that they are also living because they have a genetic material. So, it's rather controversial. Viruses come somewhere between the living, and they are in the transition between the living and the non-living, and you call them as biological puzzles. So, they are some sort of particles which have hijacked the sort of an RNA and become very infective. So, what are the most important living attributes is they have a genetic material. You understand it could either be the DNA or the RNA. They can reproduce within the host cell. They can reproduce within the host cell. They multiply within the host cell and they break down the host cell. That's how you get your sort of a, you get your common cold, and they show variations. You know, if you take the present theme of COVID comes in different sort of it has got different mutagenic lines. There are a lot of variations, and they are very, very host specific. It only affects only a few people, few populations, and it is because of the antigen properties, the foreign particle, the foreign chemical compound which is present in the protein code, which is called the antigen, and the entire world is primarily targeting on the sort of an antigen to prevent the sort of an infection of viruses. So, now, why do you call viruses as biological puzzles? We are dealing with a micro concept of viruses under the chapter of biological classification in the first year. So, when you take biology, they are in the transition between the living and the non-living. This is a very important sort of a statement because they are going to ask you assertion reasoning questions in NEET, wherein they will say, okay, why do you say it's living, why do you say it's non-living? And the next important thing is they are incapable of independent existence. They cannot live all on their own. They are incapable of independent existence. And again, when you take them, they are the exceptions to the cell theory. The cell theory proclaims, or the cell doctrine says, that all living organisms are made up of cell and their products. So, viruses, a group of infective particles called viruses, are a sort of an exception to the cell theory because you understand the cell is a basic unit of structure and function and reproduction. And the cell has got its own metabolism, it's got its own plasma membrane, it's got its own sort of a DNA. So, thereby you understand when you take a cell, it's a basic unit of life, it's capable of independent existence. Now, virus is not capable of independent existence. You understand it is an obligate intracellular parasite, and you understand cell is a basic unit of inheritance or reproduction, whereas viruses are just only infective particles. So, we understand that when you take biological organization, whenever you take biological organization, it starts at the sub-microscopic molecular level. All biology primarily starts with molecules because you know all life is carbon. So, all biological molecules primarily when you take all life, what is life? Primarily life is a unique combination of different sort of characters. Okay. Now, so here all living organisms primarily what do? They also, the feature of all living organisms is they replicate the genetic information. Now, a normal living organism like a plant, an animal, a human, or even a sort of a bacteria, they have a method of bacterial replication, whereas viruses cannot replicate all by themselves. Viruses are primarily limited and they can only replicate only when they enter into a sort of a living host. So, we are dealing with relation to primarily, the transition between the viruses, and this was just a small sort of an episode in the long run of 36 chapters which you primarily have to go to read for NEET. And in NEET we deal with a lot of things. We deal with conceptual foundations, we deal with case study approaches, we deal with assertion and reasoning, and you need to exactly ask very scientifically. So, the scientific approach towards concept learning and applications is what you primarily learn at this sort of a phase of your lifestyle. Thank you.